Good day, dear viewers. It's a pleasure to see you again on the Between Sleep and Science channel. 1,000 years of Byzantine power, the mystery of the liquid flame, wars for sacred images, the Western occupation, the Paleologos Renaissance, and the colossal cannons that ended it all. If these quiet wanderings bring you even a moment of calm, feel free to leave a few warm words, or tell us in the comments which city you're watching from, so we can see how far our explorations travel. You can also simply like and subscribe. Your support helps other weary hearts discover this cozy corner. And now, you don't need to do anything at all. Just settle in comfortably and let the slow, steady rhythm of deep time gently carry you away from your worries. Let the journey begin. Part 1. The Birth of the Second Rome. Chapter 1. The Empire that Refused to Die. Why do we call it Byzantium when the people who lived there called themselves Romans, the Romaios? Tonight, we journey into a world of gold and imperial purple, an empire that stood for 1,000 years after the collapse of the West. But what if I told you that the Byzantine Empire, strictly speaking, never existed? This isn't a riddle, it's a historical contradiction. If you had asked a resident of Constantinople in the 10th or 11th century who they were, they would have answered without hesitation, "I am a Romaios, a Roman." They would have called their state the Roman Empire or the Kingdom of the Romans. For them, history had not been interrupted. The fall of the city of Rome in 476 CEE was a tragedy, the loss of the ancient capital and the Western territories. But it was certainly not the end of the Roman Empire itself. After all, the empire continued to live. Its legitimate emperor, its senate, its armies and its laws, all of these endured in the East, in the new capital founded by the Emperor Constantine. They were Romans who spoke Greek and practiced Christianity, but their identity was inextricably linked to the legacy of Caesar and Augustus. The name Byzantium is a phantom, a convenient and beautiful label invented by historians in the 15th century, over 100 years after the empire's final demise. They needed a way to separate this medieval Christian civilization from the pagan classical Rome. So, they borrowed the name of the ancient Greek colony, Byzantium, on whose site the great Constantinople was built. Therefore, as we immerse ourselves in this history, we will use the familiar name Byzantium. But we will always remember that we are talking about the last true Romans, a civilization that saw itself as the eternal Rome and carried that proud title through a millennium of medieval storms. Chapter 2. The Crisis of the 3rd Century and the Saving Reforms. Diocletian and the Division of Power. Why Rome lost its central role. To understand why a new Rome was needed at all, we must descend into one of the darkest and most chaotic periods of Roman history, the 3rd century. Imagine a gigantic, intricate mechanism that had run for centuries, but now its gears are grinding and its supports are cracking under their own immense weight. The empire was on the brink of total collapse. This was the time historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. Barbarian tribes rampaged across the frontiers, while endless civil wars tore the empire apart from within. Instead of defending the borders, the legions were proclaiming their own generals as emperors. In just 50 years, more than 20 so-called soldier emperors cycled through the throne. Most ruled for only a year or two before being murdered by their own troops, to install a new, hopeful claimant. Currency devalued, trade stagnated, and cities emptied. It truly seemed as though the mighty Roman Empire was dying. It was into this disorder that the son of a humble freedman, the stern and brilliant general Diocletian, rose to power. He understood something his predecessors did not. The empire could no longer be saved simply by winning another battle. The very system of governance had to change. The state had become too vast and unwieldy for one man to rule effectively from a single location. Diocletian made a revolutionary decision. He divided the authority. He reasoned that the empire should have not one, but 4 ruling leaders. He split the state into 2 major halves, the Western and the Eastern. In each half, an older emperor ruled, bearing the title Augustus, and he was assisted by a junior co-ruler and heir, known as Caesar. This system became known as the Tetrarchy, the rule of 4. This pivotal move, intended to save Rome, ironically stripped it of its central role. The Tetrarch emperors no longer resided in the Eternal City. Rome was too far from the tumultuous frontiers, from the Rhine and Danube in the north and the Persian threat in the east. Diocletian made his capital Nicomedia in Asia Minor. His co-ruler in the west governed from Mediolanum, modern Milan. The other Caesars sat in cities even closer to the front lines. Rome remained a symbol, the sacred heart of the empire, but it ceased to be its command and intellectual center. Power moved to where the emperor was. Diocletian stabilized the empire, but he also unwittingly demonstrated that it could function perfectly well without Rome. He prepared the ground. Now, all that was needed was the man who would build a new eternal city on that soil. Chapter 3. Constantine the Great, Genius or Saint? The vision of the cross. In this sign, conquer. The choice of the new capital, a strategic masterpiece on the Bosporus. The system Diocletian created was intended to end civil strife, but as often happens, human ambition proved stronger than any plan. After the old emperor retired, the Tetrarchy swiftly collapsed into a new wave of struggle for power. From this bloody chaos emerged one man who was destined to change the course of history forever. His name was Constantine. Constantine was the son of one of the Caesars, and he spent his entire life in military camps. He was a man of iron will, an exceptional general, and a ruthless politician, willing to remove anyone who stood in his path, including close relatives. Yet, something else stirred within him, an attraction to a new, previously unseen deity that promised salvation not through rituals, but through faith. The moment of destiny arrived in 312 CE, on the eve of the decisive battle for Rome at the Milvian Bridge. Legend holds that Constantine, whose forces were outnumbered by the enemy's army, prayed to the unknown god. Then, in the sky, he saw a sign, a radiant cross with the inscription "In hoc signo vinces," which means, "In this sign you will conquer." Obeying the vision, Constantine ordered his soldiers to paint a new symbol on their shields. The Chi Rho, the interwoven Greek letters that are the first 2 letters of Christ's name. And he won. From that moment began the entire Roman Empire's eventual pivot toward Christianity. But Constantine understood that to build a new Christian empire, he needed a new capital. Old Rome was saturated with paganism. Its aristocracy looked down with scorn on the new faith. Geographically, it had long lost its relevance. And so, Constantine made a choice that stands as one of the greatest strategic decisions in history. he turned his gaze toward the ancient Greek town of Byzantium. The location was flawless. It stood at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, controlling the single sea lane, the Bosporus Strait, from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. Any ship carrying grain, furs, or slaves from the north, or spices and silk from the east, inevitably passed by its shores. The city was situated on a triangular peninsula, protected by water on three sides, making it an almost impregnable fortress. From here, it was easy to govern the wealthy eastern provinces and keep an eye on the main enemy, Persia. It was a site seemingly created by nature itself to be the capital of the world. And Constantine, the genius and the saint, the tyrant and the visionary, decided to build his city here, a new Rome that would eclipse the glory of the old. Chapter 4. Constantine's City, the capital of the world building. A metropolis in 6 years. Aqueducts, hippodrome, forums and the first basilica. Byzantine bread and circuses. On May 11th, 330 CE, after only 6 years of colossal construction, the solemn dedication ceremony of the new city took place. On the site of the modest Greek town rose the center of the universe. Constantine humbly named it New Rome, but in the vernacular and in history, it would forever remain the city of Constantine, Constantinople. The scale of the construction defied imagination. Constantine acted with imperial speed and grandeur. Legend claims he personally walked the boundaries with a spear in hand to mark the perimeter of the future walls. When his retinue expressed surprise at the vast extent, he replied, "I will keep walking until the angel who walks before me stops." The finest architects, engineers, and thousands of artisans were gathered from across the empire. To hasten the process, Constantine used every available resource. He essentially turned the old pagan world into a construction yard for his new Christian capital. By his order, marble columns, friezes, and, most surprisingly, famous statues were transported from Rome, Athens, Ephesus, and other ancient centers. The city became filled with masterpieces of classical art, but now they served not as objects of worship, but merely as adornments for streets and squares. It was a symbolic gesture. The old gods were defeated, serving as decor for the new empire. At the center of the city, the oval square of Constantine, or Forum, was erected. In its middle stood a gigantic porphyry column, imported from Egypt, and atop it a bronze statue of the emperor himself, styled as the sun god Apollo. Though now fitted with a halo made, it was rumored, from nails taken from the true cross. In the founder's mind, paganism and Christianity were intricately entwined. Just as in old Rome, the city's life depended on water. Gigantic aqueducts, stone rivers that carried the purest water from distant hills to fill cisterns and fountains, were built or restored. But the heart of public life, the place where the populace met the emperor, was the hippodrome. This was not just an arena for chariot races. It hosted triumphs, festivals, and even public executions. The stands could hold up to 100,000 people, and the roar of the crowd passionately supporting their teams, the Blues, Venetoi, or the Greens, Prasinoi, was audible throughout the city. And, of course, Constantine built churches. The greatest of these was the Great Church, or Megale Ekklesia in Greek, which would later be known as Hagia Sophia, Holy Wisdom. It was not yet the magnificent structure we know today, but its predecessor, a basilica, laid the foundation for the Christian capital. How was this gigantic city to be populated? Constantine moved part of the Roman Senate here, granting the aristocrats palaces and privileges. For the common people, he instituted the same system that had supported the popularity of emperors in Rome for centuries: the free distribution of grain. Every resident registered in the capital was entitled to their daily ration. Thus, the Byzantine version of bread and circuses was born, with the hippodrome providing the spectacular shows. Within a few decades, Constantinople had become one of the world's largest metropolises, a true new Rome, now without the pagan gods and with a new centre of gravity. Chapter 5. Justinian I, the last true Roman. The dream of a unified empire and the great conquests. Belisarius and Narses, the military geniuses of the age. Nearly 2 centuries passed after the founding of Constantinople. The Western Roman Empire, the one we see in films and read about in books, had ceased to exist. Its lands were parcelled out among Germanic kings, Goths, Vandals, and Franks. The shadow of the old empire seemed to have finally vanished over Europe. But in Constantinople lived a man who vehemently disagreed. His name was Justinian. He was not born in the purple. He was the son of a simple peasant who rose to power through his uncle, who became emperor. Justinian was a man of relentless energy. He was called the emperor who never slept. He was consumed by one grand, almost insane ambition: to restore the Roman Empire to its former sacred borders. He did not consider the Western lands lost. To him, they were merely temporarily occupied Roman provinces that needed to be brought back under the authority of the legitimate emperor. Justinian was the mastermind, the political will of this operation. But to realize such a monumental dream, he needed hands and swords. Fate gifted him the 2 greatest generals of his age. The first was Belisarius, a true military genius whose campaigns are still studied in academies. He had a knack for winning victories, often commanding a handful of soldiers against entire armies, relying on cunning, speed, and the iron discipline of his troops. The second was the eunuch Narses, a clever courtier and brilliant administrator who, in his advanced age, proved to be a strategist no less talented than Belisarius. And so, this machine of conquest began to move. The first target was the Vandal kingdom in North Africa. The Vandals, who had once sacked Rome, now controlled the wealthy province of Carthage and pirated in the Mediterranean. Belisarius landed in Africa with a small force, and in just a few months, in 2 brilliant battles, he utterly crushed their kingdom. Roman Africa was back in the empire. This was a resounding success that made the whole world believe Justinian's dream was achievable. The next target was Italy itself, the heart of the old empire, now ruled by the Ostrogoths. This war proved to be very different. It dragged on for almost 20 years. It was a brutal, bloody, and exhausting struggle. Belisarius would take Rome, only for the Goths to take it back. Cities changed hands repeatedly. The ancient, flourishing land of Italy was reduced to ruins. Ultimately, after Belisarius was recalled, the old Narses finished the job, decisively defeating the Goths. Italy, devastated and ravaged, was Roman once more. Imperial forces then recovered the southeastern part of Spain from the Visigoths and reclaimed the Mediterranean islands. For a fleeting moment, the map of the world looked almost as it had during Rome's zenith. The Mediterranean Sea was again, as the ancients called it, Mare Nostrum, our sea. Justinian, sitting in his Constantinopolitan palace, seemed to have reversed the tide of history. But this grand dream came at a terrible, enormous cost that the empire had yet to pay. Chapter 6. Justinian's Plague. The invisible enemy, a foe that killed a third of the empire and buried the dream of restoration. At the peak of triumph, when the golden eagle of Rome seemed to spread its wings once more over the Mediterranean, an enemy entered the empire that could not be defeated with a sword. An enemy invisible, ruthless, and pervasive. It arrived in 541 CE via the empire's main artery, the trade route from Egypt. The ships that for centuries had carried life-giving grain to the capital this time brought death. Along with the grain, the holds carried rats, and on the rats, fleas, transporting the monstrous disease we now know as the bubonic plague. It struck the capital with apocalyptic fury. Doctors were helpless. They understood neither the cause nor the cure. People fell ill suddenly. Fever began, delirium followed, and then dark swellings, the enlarged lymph nodes, appeared on the body, giving the disease its name, buboes. Death came within a few days. Constantinople, the bustling, crowded center of the world, turned into a city of the dead. Shops closed, streets emptied. Thousands died every day. At first, they were buried, but soon the gravediggers could not keep up. Bodies were simply stacked in courtyards and towers, and then taken out by boat and dumped into the sea. The stench of death enveloped the great city. Even Emperor Justinian himself fell sick. The entire empire held its breath, praying for his recovery. Miraculously, unlike millions of his subjects, he survived. But when he recovered, he looked out onto a completely changed world. The plague was not confined to the capital. Like a wildfire, it swept across the entire empire, from Persia to the British Isles. In some regions, a third of the population perished, in others, half. Villages were completely wiped out. Fields stood unharvested because there was no one left to work them. It was the plague, not a barbarian army, that delivered the mortal blow to Justinian's dream. It struck at the very root of imperial power. The number of taxpayers plummeted. The treasury emptied. There was no money to maintain the army, and no men left to replenish it. Recruits were dying in their villages. The recently reconquered lands in Italy and Africa had no one to defend them, and soon began to slip from the empire's weakening grasp. The Golden Age was abruptly halted. The Great Restoration choked on its own ambition. Justinian's plague was not merely a demographic disaster. It became the invisible wall that decisively separated the era of antiquity from the Middle Ages, demonstrating how fragile the grandest human endeavors can be in the face of nature's silent forces. Chapter 7. The Nika Revolt. When sport turned to blood. How chariot races escalated into a riot that nearly toppled the emperor. Empress Theodora's role. Purple makes the noblest shroud. Even before the plague devastated the empire, Justinian's reign was nearly cut short by the fire of the most terrible revolt Constantinople had ever seen. And it began where the heart of the city's popular life beat, the hippodrome. In Byzantium, chariot racing was more than a sport. It was an all-consuming passion. Politics and religion rolled into one. The entire population of the capital was divided into supporters of the two main teams or factions, the Blues, Venetoi, and the Greens, Prasinoi. Each faction had its own colours, its own idolized charioteers, and its own neighbourhoods in the city. They were like modern football ultras, but with genuine political influence. The emperors traditionally supported one of the factions to secure its loyalty. Justinian and his wife, Empress Theodora, favored the blues. In January 532 CE, after a fresh outbreak of disorder, city authorities arrested several instigators belonging to both parties and condemned them to death. But the execution was botched, and a few of the condemned sought refuge in a nearby church. Then the unthinkable happened. Sworn enemies, the Blues and the Greens, united against the authorities. At the next races, in the presence of Justinian, the crowd in the hippodrome, instead of their usual greetings, began to chant in unison, demanding clemency for the condemned. The emperor refused. It was then that a rallying cry swept through the stands, giving the revolt its name. The crowd began to chant, "Nika! Nika!" which means conquer or win in Greek. But now this cry was directed not at the charioteers, but against the emperor himself. Thousands surged out of the hippodrome and into the streets. Constantinople descended into chaos. Looting and arson began. The mob, steered by dissatisfied aristocrats, besieged the imperial palace. The city's most beautiful buildings, including the first church of Hagia Sophia, perished in the flames. The rebels even proclaimed a new emperor, the nephew of a previous ruler. Justinian was broken. His power was crumbling before his eyes. Panic reigned in the palace. The emperor and his closest advisors had already gathered the treasury and prepared ships to flee the capital and save their lives. It seemed all was lost. At this precise moment, when the men had surrendered to fear, a woman spoke up. Empress Theodora, a former actress, a girl from humble beginnings, whom Justinian had, against all laws and traditions, made his wife and co-ruler. She stood before the bewildered noblemen and delivered a speech that changed the course of history. She argued that flight, even if it saved their lives, was dishonorable, that a person who had once worn the crown should not become an exile. "As for me," she declared, "I remain, and I embrace the ancient saying, 'Purple makes the noblest shroud.'" In other words, she preferred to die an empress than to live in disgrace. Her words, her incredible courage, jolted Justinian and his generals back to reality. Shame proved stronger than fear. The escape plan was abandoned. The emperor's loyal generals, Belisarius and Mundus, gathered all the troops remaining in the city, mostly barbarian mercenaries who were immune to the capital's passions. They acted swiftly and ruthlessly. One contingent stormed the hippodrome, where the rioters were still raging through the main gate. Others entered through side passages, blocking all exits. The arena, recently a center of sporting passion, became a death trap. A massacre began. By the end of that day, the bodies of over 30,000 people lay on the hippodrome floor. The Nika revolt was drowned in blood. Justinian survived and became the absolute, undisputed master. And on the site of the burned-out old basilica, he vowed to build a new Hagia Sophia that the world had never seen. Chapter 8. Hagia Sophia, a miracle of architecture, building the temple with a dome suspended from heaven on a golden chain, the architectural and spiritual symbol for 1,000 years. On the ashes left behind by the Nika revolt, Justinian resolved to erect not just a church, but a true wonder of the world. It was to be a monument to his triumph, a symbol of unshakable power, and most importantly, a home for the divine wisdom itself, to whom the temple was dedicated, Hagia Sophia. He discarded all the old canons. He did not want a simple, long basilica like those built before him. His dream was bold and nearly impossible, to cover a massive square space with a gigantic circular dome, creating a single, light-filled interior that would stun the visitor and lift the soul toward the heavens. For this task, he hired not mere architects, but two of the greatest scholars of the age, Anthemius and Isidore of Miletus. They were brilliant mathematicians, physicists, and geometers, and they set about solving an unprecedented engineering problem. Construction proceeded at a phenomenal pace. For 5 years, 10,000 workers labored day and night. The finest materials were transported to Constantinople from every corner of the restored empire. Green marble from Thessaly, white from the island of Proconnesus, rose-colored from Phrygia, porphyry columns from the temples of Egypt, and emerald-hued stone from the temple of Artemis at Ephesus. All the heritage of the ancient world was placed at the service of this new Christian marvel. The main challenge was the dome. How could a massive circular vault be supported by only 4 pillars forming a square? Anthemius and Isidore employed a genius solution. Using special triangular vaulted structures called pendentives, they smoothly transitioned from the square base to the dome's circle. The immense weight of the construction was distributed through a system of semi-domes and arches, creating an impression of lightness and harmony. But the chief wonder that astonished all contemporaries was the illumination. All around the dome's base, the architects cut 40 windows, placed so close together that the stone supports between them were barely visible. On a clear, sunny day, the light pouring in from these windows created an incredible effect. It blurred the boundary between the dome and its supports, making it seem as if the dome did not rest on the walls, but rather floated in the air, suspended from the heavens on a golden chain. As one historian wrote, when the construction was completed in 537 CE and Justinian first walked beneath the arches, he was overwhelmed. The temple's interior, flooded with light and adorned with tons of golden mosaics shimmering in the rays, seemed not like a creation of human hands, but a piece of the celestial world. Legend says that after surveying the splendor, the emperor whispered, "Solomon, I have surpassed you." For 1,000 years, Hagia Sophia became the principal cathedral of the entire Christian world, the heart of the Orthodox faith, and the symbol of the Byzantine Empire's might. Here, emperors were crowned. Here they prayed for victory. And it was here, under this floating dome, that the Byzantines most keenly felt their connection to God and to eternity. Part 2. The Shield of Christianity and the Besieged Fortress. Chapter 9. Heraclius and the Persian Threat. The Epic War with the Sassanids. The Return of the True Cross. An empire saved from the brink. Justinian's great conquests came at a high price for the empire. They drained its treasury and its army. And while Byzantium, weakened by plague and wars, tried to hold on to the lands it had recovered in the west, in the east, its oldest, most powerful and most implacable enemy, the Sassanid Persian Empire, was gathering strength. It was a clash of two worlds, two contemporary superpowers that had continued for centuries. But in the early 7th century, it reached its terrifying peak. The ambitious and cruel Persian Shah Kavad launched a total war of annihilation. For Byzantium, it was a disaster. Persian armies, like an unstoppable torrent, flooded the imperial provinces. Damascus fell, Antioch fell. And then, in 614 CE, An event occurred that shook the entire Christian world to its core. The Persians captured Jerusalem. The holy city was looted, its churches burned, and the principal relic of Christianity, the true cross, upon which Christ was believed to have been crucified, was seized as a trophy and carried away to Persia. This was not just a military defeat, it was a profound spiritual humiliation. It seemed that God had turned away from his empire. Soon, the Persians also conquered Egypt, the granary of Constantinople. The capital was cut off from its essential grain supply. Simultaneously, from the north, hordes of Avars and Slavs poured into the Balkans, reaching the very walls of Constantinople. The empire faced total destruction. It was caught in a vice between two enemies. Its best provinces were lost, its holy relics defiled, and its people were starving and desperate. It was in this dark hour that the Emperor Heraclius reigned. He watched the enemy campfires burning on the Asian shore of the Bosporus, and was so close to despair that he considered moving the capital to Carthage. But the patriarch and the people pleaded with him to stay. Heraclius then made a decision that seemed insane. He decided to launch a counterstrike, but not where the enemy expected it. Instead of trying to retake the lost provinces, he planned to strike at the enemy's very heart. He transformed the conflict into a holy war, essentially the First Crusade, long before the official ones. The church surrendered all its treasures to finance the campaign. Troops marched into battle with icons instead of banners. In 622 CE, Heraclius, leaving the capital under the protection of the Mother of God, sailed from Constantinople with a small but devoted army and landed deep behind Persian lines in the Caucasus. Thus began a multi-year, grueling campaign across enemy territory. Heraclius proved to be a brilliant commander. He routed one Persian army after another, pushing deeper into Mesopotamia. The climax came in 627 CE at the Battle of Nineveh, near the ruins of the ancient Assyrian capital. The Roman army utterly crushed the last forces of the Persian Shah. Soon after, Shah Kavad was overthrown and murdered in a palace coup. The Persian Empire dissolved into chaos. Heraclius returned to Constantinople, an absolute triumph. He recovered all the captured lands, and most importantly, he returned the true cross. The scene of the emperor, dressed as a humble pilgrim, personally carrying the great relic back into Jerusalem, became the ultimate symbol of a miraculous salvation and a monumental victory. Heraclius had saved the empire. He had crushed its eternal enemy. Yet, in this titanic 20-year struggle, both great powers, Byzantium and Persia, had exhausted each other completely. They did not yet know that from the depths of the Arabian desert, a new, young and ferocious force was already rising, ready to crash upon their weakened lands. Chapter 10. The Arab Storm, the new force from the desert, the loss of Syria, Egypt and Africa. How Byzantium became the bulwark that protected Europe. Emperor Heraclius's triumph was great but tragically short-lived. The immense war left both empires, Byzantium and Persia, bleeding and utterly exhausted. They were like two old, wounded lions who lay down to rest after a mortal fight, failing to notice the pack of young, hungry hyenas approaching from the desert. This new force was born in the sands of Arabia. It was forged in the fire of a new faith, Islam, and unified by the will of the Prophet Muhammad. After his death, the Arab tribes who had fought each other for centuries rushed outward in a single, irresistible wave. This was not just an army. It was a spiritual wildfire that consumed the entire Near East. The first strike hit the very provinces Heraclius had just wrested back from the Persians. The Roman legions, once considered invincible, faced an entirely new kind of enemy. Light, swift cavalry, galvanized by a fanatical belief in the righteousness of their cause. In 636 CE, at the decisive Battle of Yarmouk River, the imperial army in Syria was completely annihilated. For the aging emperor Heraclius, who never recovered from the shock, this was the end of everything. One after another, the ancient cities fell: Damascus, Antioch. And then, only a few years after the triumphant return of the cross, the Arabs captured Jerusalem. It continued. The next target was Egypt. This was more than a setback. It was a catastrophe. Egypt was the breadbasket, the feeder of Constantinople. Losing it meant the empire lost its main source of grain. Alexandria, the greatest scientific and cultural center of the ancient world, fell. Then, the Arab advance rolled further west along the entire North African coast. Carthage, the city Belisarius had recovered, fell. In just a few decades, Byzantium lost 2/3 of its territory and population. All the wealthiest, most ancient provinces, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and Africa, came under the rule of the Arab Caliphate. Why did this happen so quickly? First, because of the total exhaustion following the war with Persia. The empire simply had no money or soldiers left for a proper resistance. Second, religious dissension played its part. The majority of the population in Syria and Egypt adhered to monophysitism, which Constantinople considered a heresy. They had been persecuted for centuries. For many of them, the rule of the Arabs, who were initially tolerant of the people of the book, seemed a lesser evil than the authority of the distant and hostile Orthodox emperor. After this storm, Byzantium was changed forever. It ceased to be the universal Mediterranean empire, the heir to Rome. It shrank, becoming a far more compact, fundamentally Greek state, and it gained a new historical mission. For the next 700 years, Byzantium would stand as the shield, the bulwark of the Christian world, absorbing and holding back all the waves of invaders from the east, thereby giving the young and still weak Europe time to be born and to grow strong behind its protection. Chapter 11. Greek Fire, the Empire's Secret Weapon. Medieval napalm, that water could not quench. How it saved Constantinople. Twice from Arab fleets, the Arab storm had no intention of stopping after the conquest of the provinces. Its ultimate goal was Constantinople itself, the new Rome. By destroying it, the Caliphate would crush its main enemy and open the path into the very heart of Europe. The Arabs, having become masters of the seas, assembled colossal fleets to take the impregnable city. Twice they were certain of victory. But the besieged empire held a secret that was guarded better than any treasury and prized more highly than gold. It was the absolute weapon of its time, a technological miracle that struck superstitious terror into its enemies. In history, it is remembered as Greek fire. Imagine the terror of the Arab sailors. Their ships approached the walls of the great city. Suddenly, from the Byzantine vessels, equipped with special bronze siphons, a stream of liquid fire erupts onto them. But this was no ordinary fire. It clung to the wood, to the sails, and to the men's bodies. It could not be extinguished with water. On the contrary, contact with water only made it burn harder. The sea around the Arab ships turned into a fiery inferno. Wooden vessels burst into flames like dry tinder, and men who jumped overboard hoping to escape burned alive right in the water. The exact composition of this medieval napalm remains a mystery to this day. We know that its main components were likely crude petroleum mixed with sulfur, resin, and other flammable agents. But the secret lay not only in the mixture, but also in the method of its deployment, the pumps and siphons that allowed the stream of fire to be hurled over dozens of yards. The recipe and technology were kept under the strictest secrecy, with disclosure punishable by death. The invention is attributed to a Syrian engineer and refugee named Kallinikos, who brought the secret to Constantinople. This weapon saved the empire twice. The first great Arab siege of Constantinople lasted 4 years, from 674 to 678 CE. Every summer, the Arab fleet approached the city, and every summer, the Byzantine ships burned it using Greek fire. Eventually, having lost the majority of their fleet, the Arabs were forced to retreat. The second, even more terrifying attempt came in 717 CE. A massive army and a fleet numbering almost 2,000 ships again encircled the city. It seemed that this time the fall was inevitable. But Greek fire performed its duty once more. It destroyed the fleet that was supposed to blockade the city from the sea. Left without support and supplies, the huge Arab land army was trapped beneath the city walls for an entire winter, which, ironically, turned out to be incredibly harsh. Famine, disease, and constant Byzantine counterattacks completed the rout. Greek fire became more than just a weapon. It became a legend, a symbol of Byzantium's technological superiority and divine protection. It allowed the empire to hold firm during its darkest hour, to withstand the caliphate's onslaught, and to preserve itself as the very shield that protected the nascent continent of Europe. Chapter 12. Life Under Siege. The Theme System. The new military administrative system. The soldier-farmer as the foundation of the empire's defense. The victories won with the aid of Greek fire gave the empire a respite, but did not solve the main problem. Byzantium had survived, but how was it to live on? It had lost its wealthiest provinces. The treasury was empty, and enemies still stood at its drastically reduced borders. The old Roman system, with its vast, professional and very expensive mercenary army, no longer worked. The empire had no money to pay the legions. Something entirely new had to be invented. Under the pressure of cruel necessity, the Byzantines created one of the most effective military administrative systems in history. It is known as the theme system. The idea was simple and brilliant. The empire divided all its remaining territory, mostly Asia Minor and the Balkans, into large military districts called themes. The word thema originally meant a military unit. Now, it also designated the land where that unit was garrisoned. At the head of each theme stood a strategos, a military general who now possessed full military and civil authority in his province. This allowed for quick and decisive action without waiting for orders from distant Constantinople, which was vital under the stress of constant enemy raids. But who served in these armies? Herein lies the core of the entire system. Instead of paying soldiers a salary, the state gave them land. Every soldier, called a stratiotes, was granted a hereditary plot. In exchange for this land, the stratiote was obligated to report for duty at the first alarm, fully armed and mounted on his own horse. This military obligation was passed down from father to son along with the land. Thus was born a new type of imperial defender, the soldier-farmer, a man who held a plough in one hand and a sword in the other. In peacetime, he cultivated his plot, fed his family, and paid a small tax. But when the watchtower signaled the approach of an Arab raiding party, he would drop the plough, don his armor, take his weapon, and join his neighbors, fellow stratiotes, to repel the enemy. This system had enormous advantages. First, it was incredibly cheap for the treasury. Second, it created a highly motivated army. The stratiotes were not fighting for a distant emperor or an abstract idea of empire. They fought for their home, their land, and their family, which were right there, behind their backs. It was popular territorial defense at its finest. For several centuries, the theme system and the stratiotes formed the backbone of Byzantium. It was these soldier farmers, scattered throughout the mountains and valleys of Asia Minor, who held back the caliphate's advance, exhausting the enemy in endless guerrilla warfare. It was they who allowed the besieged fortress not merely to survive, but over time to accumulate strength and transition back to the counteroffensive. Chapter 13. Iconoclasm, a century of war over images. Why emperors decided icons were evil, the schism, the riots, and the triumph of orthodoxy. In every Byzantine home, from the emperor's palace to the simple stratiote's cottage, there was a sacred corner where icons, images of Christ, the Mother of God, and the saints, stood, with an oil lamp burning before them. These were not mere paintings. For the Romaios, icons were windows into the celestial world, silent conversation partners, and protectors of home and family. People prayed before them, kissed them, and carried them into battle. Now, imagine the shock and horror that gripped the empire when, in the 8th century, the emperor himself, God's anointed, declared these sacred images to be idols and their veneration a mortal sin. This movement became known in history as iconoclasm, the war against images. It did not begin in a vacuum. The empire was going through a terrible crisis. It had lost its wealthiest provinces to the Arab onslaught. Constant defeats, earthquakes, and epidemics, all this compelled people to ask, why has God turned away from us? What is our sin? And Emperor Leo III the Isaurian, a stern soldier from the empire's eastern edges, decided he had found the answer. He saw the successes of his enemies, the Muslims and the Jews, whose religions strictly forbade any depiction of God. He read the Old Testament commandment, "You shall not make for yourself a graven image." He concluded, God is angry at the Romaios because they have fallen into idolatry, worshipping not God himself, but merely wood and paint. And so, a chilling order swept across the empire. Soldiers broke into churches. They smashed priceless mosaics with hammers, scraped the faces of the saints from the walls, and burned thousands of icons on bonfires. It was a forceful attempt to purify the faith. The empire split in two. On one side were the iconoclast emperors and a large part of the army, especially the eastern contingents that had constant contact with the Islamic world. On the other side were those called the iconophiles, or venerators of icons. This group comprised the overwhelming majority of the common people, especially women, and most importantly, the monks. Monasteries were the main centers for the creation of icons, and the monks became the chief ideologues of their defense. This spiritual civil war raged for over 100 years. It was filled with cruelty. Monks were exiled, tortured, and executed. Cities rioted. The empire, which needed all its unity to fight external foes, was tearing itself apart in an agonizing internal conflict. And, ironically, the end of the dispute was brought about by women. First, the Empress Irene in the late 8th century, and then, definitively, the Empress Theodora, a different Empress Theodora, in 843 CE, restored the veneration of icons. This day became known in history as the triumph of orthodoxy, and is still celebrated by the Orthodox Church. The victory of the iconophiles meant more than just the return of pictures to the churches. It affirmed one of the central tenets of Christianity. God, the invisible and incomprehensible, became man in Jesus Christ. Since he became visible, he can be depicted. The icon is not an idol, but a testament to the fact that God entered our world. It was a deep, painful scar on the body of the empire, yet it helped the Byzantines finally formalize the foundations of their faith. Chapter 14. Diplomacy or Duplicity. The Byzantine art of managing barbarians, bribery, flattery, dynastic marriages, and playing enemies against each other. If the theme system and the stratiotes were the muscles of the empire, protecting its body, then its brain, its chief weapon for survival, was diplomacy. The Byzantines honed the art of managing the external world to the highest level, transforming it into a genuine science. They perfectly understood that in their position, surrounded by enemies and perpetually short on resources, relying only on the sword was a path to suicide. Any war that could be avoided should be avoided. And the best battle is the one won without a single fight. In Constantinople, there was an entire department that could be called the Bureau of Barbarian Affairs. Its spies and envoys operated across the known world, from the steppes of Ukraine to the courts of the Frankish kings. They gathered intelligence: who was feuding with whom, which chieftain was greedy for gold, who was vain, whose wife had died, and whether it was time to offer him a new one. All this information flowed back to the capital onto a gigantic chessboard where the emperor and his advisors played their games. The primary tool was, of course, bribery. Gold flowed like a river from the imperial treasury. Annual gifts and subsidies maintained peace on the borders. Chieftains of nomads like the Pechenegs or Cumans were paid not to attack the empire, and, better yet, to attack the empire's other enemies. The Byzantines masterfully played their opponents against each other, adhering to the old Roman principle: divide and rule. The second tool was flattery. Barbarian leaders, who were only yesterday considered savages, were invited to Constantinople. They were received with incredible pomp, led through the glittering halls of the great palace, and seated at receptions near the emperor himself. They were granted impressive Roman titles: patrician, master of soldiers, consul. These titles offered no real authority within the empire. But for a chieftain returning to his tribe, it was an immense badge of prestige. He was now not merely a leader, but the friend of the great emperor of the Romaios. His loyalty was bought not only with gold, but with a sense of his own importance. The sons of foreign rulers often resided at court. They were taken as hostages, but housed in luxury. They were taught Greek, refined manners, and theology. They were barbarians in golden cages. When the time came, such a Byzantine-educated prince could be placed on the throne of his homeland, thereby gaining a loyal ally. Finally, the highest instrument of diplomacy was dynastic marriage. Giving a princess, born in the sacred purple chamber of the palace, in marriage to a barbarian ruler was an extreme but highly effective measure. It turned a dangerous enemy into a family member. It was in this way, by marrying his sister Anna to Prince Igor of the Kievan realm, that Byzantium not only secured itself from raids by the Eastern Slavs, but also brought orthodoxy to the Rus, permanently incorporating it into its spiritual and cultural orbit. It was a complex, cynical, but incredibly effective system. The Byzantines viewed the surrounding world as a raging ocean and themselves as a solitary island of reason and order. And for that island not to sink, any means were acceptable. For them, this was not duplicity, but the highest form of state wisdom. Chapter 15. The Golden Age, the Macedonian Dynasty. Basil. The peasant who became emperor, a flowering of culture, law, and military might. Following the iconoclast storm and the constant wars with the Arabs, Byzantium entered a period that historians call its Golden Age. It is linked to the rule of the Macedonian dynasty, though, ironically, its founder, Basil I, was by descent an outsider, a man from the remote Illyrian provinces, certainly not a Greek or a descendant of the old Roman nobility. Basil IV's story was one of incredible destiny. From a simple peasant and horse handler, he clawed his way into the imperial guard through sheer strength, intellect, and astonishing luck. He then became the emperor's favorite, eventually seizing the throne through intrigue and murder. He was a ruthless usurper, but he proved to be one of the most outstanding rulers in Byzantine history. With his ascent to the throne in 867 CE, the empire began a period of unprecedented flourishing that lasted nearly 2 centuries. After an era of sheer survival, the time for offense arrived. Military might. The army, based on the Stratiote system, was finally able to shift from deep defense to counterattack. Byzantine forces, led by talented generals, began to reclaim lands from the weakening caliphate that had been lost centuries earlier. Crete, Cyprus, and parts of Syria, including the strategically vital city of Antioch, were recovered. The empire was once again a force respected and feared. Cultural flourishing. Constantinople again became the shining beacon of civilization. This was a time of great scholars such as Patriarch Photius and Constantine Porphyrogenitos, an emperor-scholar who not only ruled, but wrote treatises on geography and diplomacy, leaving behind an invaluable testament to the surrounding world. Universities and schools opened in the capital, and ancient manuscripts of Plato, Aristotle, and Hippocrates, saved from oblivion, were copied and bound. The era that the West calls the Dark Ages was, in Byzantium, a time of bookish wisdom and sophisticated manners. Legal reform. Justinian's code, written 300 years earlier, was outdated and overly complex. Under the Macedonian dynasty, Byzantine jurists undertook a new revision, creating more compact and understandable compilations of laws. This became the pinnacle of Byzantine law and laid the foundations for the legal systems of many nations in southeastern Europe. Missionary activity. It was during this period that the most crucial event for the Slavic peoples occurred, their conversion to Christianity. The emperors sent the 2 brothers, Cyril and Methodius, to Great Moravia. They created the Slavic alphabet, Cyrillic, and translated the Holy Scriptures and liturgical books. Through these missions and the subsequent baptism of the Kievan realm, Byzantium extended its spiritual and cultural influence across Eastern Europe, creating the so-called Byzantine Commonwealth, an Orthodox world that persists to this day. The culmination of this golden age was the reign of Basil II, the Bulgar slayer. This ascetic emperor and strategist spent nearly his entire life on military campaigns. His sole obsession was the complete subjugation of the Bulgarian Empire, a powerful neighbor in the Balkans. He achieved his goal. After his victory in 1014, he ordered the blinding of 15,000 captured Bulgarian prisoners, leaving one-eyed guide for every 100 men to lead them home and show their Tsar the wrath of the Romayos. It was for this inhuman brutality that he earned his chilling nickname. But his victory meant that by the time of his death in 1025, the Byzantine Empire had reached its greatest territorial extent since the days of Justinian. It was a brief moment when the empire once again felt like the undisputed mistress of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Balkans. Part 3. The Slow Sunset and the Fall. Chapter 16. The Great Schism of 1054. How and why the paths of Rome and Constantinople permanently diverged. The split of the single Christian church into Catholic and Orthodox. At the peak of its power, when Basil II, the Bulgar slayer, ruled the empire, it seemed that no force could topple Byzantium. But in the shadow of these military triumphs, another, far deeper and more painful rift was developing. A rift not with an external enemy, but with its sister power, the western half of the Christian world, Rome. For centuries, the Christian church had been one, albeit with two main centers, Rome and Constantinople. But gradually, a fissure developed between them that grew wider and wider. It was a slow, almost imperceptible divergence, like the drifting of continents. First, they spoke different languages. The West spoke Latin, the East spoke Greek. Theologians from both sides increasingly misunderstood each other, reading different authors and interpreting the same ideas differently. Second, they had different political destinies. In the West, the Roman Empire collapsed. The Bishop of Rome, the Pope, remained the sole authority amidst the chaos of the barbarian kingdoms. He became not only a spiritual, but also a powerful political leader who could crown kings and emperors. In the East, however, the Patriarch of Constantinople always resided under the authority of the mighty Emperor of the Romayos. Therefore, in the West, the notion of the Pope's supremacy over any secular power emerged, while in the East, the idea of symphonia, a harmonious union between church and state, prevailed. Rites also differed. In the West, priests had to observe celibacy. In the East, they could marry. In the West, unleavened bread was used for the Eucharist. In the East, leavened bread was used. These seemingly minor details gradually became symbols of one's own identity and the other's incorrectness. But there were two primary, unresolved contradictions. The first was the issue of authority. The Pope of Rome increasingly asserted that he was the head of the entire universal church, the vicar of Christ on earth, to whom all other patriarchs, including Constantinople's, must submit. The Byzantines agreed to consider the Pope the first among equals, the most respected, but not the absolute monarch of the Church. For them, the only head of the Church could be Christ himself. The second was the theological dispute over the Filioque. The original creed, common to all Christians, stated that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father. The Western Church, at some point, added a single Latin word, filioque, meaning and the Son. Now their creed stated that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. For the Byzantines, this was an unacceptable distortion of a fundamental dogma accepted at the ecumenical councils. And so, in 1054 CE, this cup of tension overflowed. A delegation from the Pope of Rome arrived in Constantinople, led by Cardinal Alaric, an extremely imperious, arrogant man not given to compromise. He clashed with the equally proud and unyielding Patriarch Leo. Negotiations immediately stalled and devolved into an exchange of insults. Then, on July the 16th, 1054, Cardinal Alaric committed an unheard-of act. During a service, he entered the altar of Hagia Sophia and placed a papal bull of excommunication on the high altar, condemning Patriarch Leo and all his followers. In response, the Patriarch convened a synod and excommunicated Alaric and his entire delegation. At the time, perhaps many believed this was just another serious conflict that would eventually be resolved, but they were wrong. This exchange of curses became the point of no return. The unified Christian Church split into two branches that have since gone their separate ways: the Roman Catholic Church in the West and the Orthodox Church in the East. This event, known as the Great Schism, dealt Byzantium a wound from which it essentially never recovered. It lost hope for any real aid from the Christian West, which would have fatal consequences for it in the future. Chapter 17. New Enemies, Seljuk Turks and Normans. The catastrophe at Manzikert, 1071. The battle from which the empire never recovered. After the death of Basil II, the Bulgar slayer, the empire seemed to rest on its laurels. It was vast, wealthy, and its enemies were vanquished. But this security proved to be an illusion. The successors of the great emperor were weak, indecisive men, more interested in court intrigue than the state of the army. They made a fatal mistake. Fearing the influence of the military aristocrats, they began to disband the theme armies, the very foundation of Byzantine power. The soldier farmers were replaced by expensive and often unreliable foreign mercenaries. The empire was voluntarily breaking its own backbone. It was precisely at this moment of weakness that two new, predatory and incredibly dangerous enemies appeared on its horizon, almost simultaneously from two opposite directions. From the west, the Normans arrived in southern Italy. These were descendants of the Vikings who had settled in France, fierce, ruthless, and brilliant warriors seeking new lands. Led by the cunning and ambitious Robert Guiscard, they systematically began to reclaim Byzantium's last Italian possessions. But the true existential threat came from the east. From the depths of the Central Asian steppes, a new wave of conquerors, the Seljuk Turks, poured into the Near East. These were nomadic tribes who had recently embraced Sunni Islam, and they possessed all the fury and energy of the newly converted. They crushed the old Arab caliphate and established their own vast empire. Unlike the Arabs, who had long since transitioned to settled life, the Seljuks remained nomads. Their raids into Asia Minor, the heart of the Byzantine Empire, were not merely plundering expeditions. They brought their herds, burned fields, destroyed cities and irrigation systems, turning once flourishing lands into pasture. Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes, a brave military leader, understood that this threat had to be stopped at any cost. In 1071, he gathered a huge but very motley army, remnants of the theme forces, elite guard regiments, and many mercenaries. Franks, Normans, and, ironically, warriors from the Turkic Pecheneg and Uzay tribes. With this army, he marched east into Armenia to give the Seljuks a decisive battle. This battle took place near the city of Manzikert. The Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan, the brave lion, was a cunning general. His army was smaller, but consisted of fast, maneuverable cavalry. During the battle, the Byzantines began to push the Seljuks back. But at some point, near evening, Emperor Romanos ordered an organized retreat back to the camp. It was at this moment that treachery occurred. One of his generals, General Lucius, a political opponent, intentionally spread the rumor that the emperor was killed and led an entire reserve corps away from the battlefield. Panic and confusion spread through the Byzantine ranks. The light Seljuk cavalry, seeing this, wheeled around and struck the disorganized troops. Turkic mercenaries in the Byzantine army defected to their kinsmen. The battle turned into a slaughter. The army was annihilated. But the most terrible and humiliating event happened at the end. The emperor of the Ramaios himself, God's anointed, was wounded and taken prisoner. The image of Sultan Alp Arslan placing his foot on the neck of the captive Byzantine emperor became the enduring symbol of this disaster. But the defeat itself was not the main blow. The main blow was the civil war that followed. While Romanos was in captivity, a new emperor was proclaimed in Constantinople. When the Sultan released Romanos, he attempted to reclaim the throne, but was captured, blinded, and soon died from his wounds. The empire plunged into chaos and infighting. The eastern border was left defenseless. The Seljuk Turks, who until then had only been conducting raids, now flooded into Asia Minor as if through an open gate and began to settle it. Asia Minor was the heart of the empire. It was its main demographic, economic, and military base. Its loss was a mortal wound. The Battle of Manzikert did not destroy Byzantium, but it marked the beginning of its end. It would never truly recover from this blow. It was from the depths of this despair, having lost its main stronghold, that the empire would soon turn its gaze to the west with a desperate plea for help. Chapter 18. The Komnenian Dynasty, the last ray of hope. Alexios I. Komnenos and his desperate call for aid to the west that led to the Crusades. After the disaster at Manzikert and the subsequent civil war, the empire stared into the abyss. Its heart, Asia Minor, was seized by the Seljuk Turks, who established their own sultanate there, with its capital at Nicaea, just 60 miles from Constantinople. From the west, the Normans were attacking the Balkans. From the north, hordes of Pecheneg nomads were crossing the Danube. The state was disintegrating. In this darkest of hours, when destruction seemed inevitable, a man ascended the throne who would become one of the most outstanding diplomats and reformers in Byzantine history. His name was Alexios I Komnenos. Alexios was a representative of the military aristocracy, a brilliant general and an even more brilliant schemer. He seized power in 1081 and inherited what was no longer an empire, but its phantom. The treasury was empty, the army was shattered, and enemies were everywhere. Most people in his position would have given up, but not Alexios. He spent his life stitching together the torn fabric of the empire. He acted like a skilled physician trying to save a hopeless patient. He pitted one enemy against another, forming alliances with the Cuman nomads to defeat the Pechenegs. He waged grueling wars against the Normans in the Balkans. he implemented a currency reform to save the economy. Slowly, step by step, with incredible tenacity, he pulled the empire back from the edge of the precipice. But one major problem remained unsolved: the Turks in Asia Minor. Alexios understood that without recovering these lands, without the human and material resources of that region, the empire was condemned to a slow decline. Yet, his own strength was insufficient for the task. The army was too small. And so, in desperation, Alexios Komnenos made a decision that would forever change the history of both the East and the West. He decided to ask for help from those whom Byzantium simultaneously scorned and feared: the Latins, the Christians of the West. He knew that Western Europe was home to many warriors, especially the knights, well-trained heavy cavalry that his army sorely lacked. He also knew that many of them were landless younger sons, ready to go anywhere in search of glory and wealth. And he decided to hire them. In 1095, his envoys arrived in Italy at a church council where they addressed Pope Urban II. Alexios's request was specific and pragmatic. He asked the Pope to help him recruit a corps of Western mercenary knights. He was ready to pay them generously. These knights were to enter the emperor's service, swear an oath of loyalty to him, and help recover the Byzantine cities in Asia Minor. But Pope Urban II saw something entirely different in this request. He saw a chance to strengthen his authority, to channel the restless energy of European knighthood outward, stopping the endless internal wars, and perhaps even a chance to heal the schism of 1054 by aiding the Eastern Christians. And he transformed the modest request for mercenaries into something colossal. At the famous Council of Clermont in France, the Pope delivered a fiery speech. He spoke not of aiding Byzantium, but of the humiliation of Christians in the East and the defilement of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. He called on everyone, rich and poor, to sew crosses onto their clothing and embark on a great armed pilgrimage to liberate the Holy Land from the hands of the infidels. And the crowd answered him with a single deafening cry: "Deus vult!" God wills it. Alexios Komnenos had asked for a stream of professional soldiers he could manage. Instead, he unleashed an avalanche, an entire populace. Tens of thousands of knights, commoners, women and children set off for the east. Alexios wanted to hire a fire brigade, but instead an uncontrollable volcano headed toward his home. The First Crusade had begun, and very soon the emperor would realize that the cure he requested might be far worse than the disease itself. Chapter 19. The Crusaders, allies who became a curse. How saviors turned into marauders, the growing mistrust between Latins and Greeks. When the first detachments of Crusaders reached the borders of the Byzantine Empire, Emperor Alexios Komnenos must have realized the colossal mistake he had made. He expected a disciplined corps of elite mercenaries. Instead, an uncontrollable, chaotic mob poured onto his lands. The first to arrive were the poor, the so-called Peasants' Crusade, led by the fanatical preacher Peter the Hermit. This was a horde of hungry, ragged and poorly armed people who believed they were led by God himself. They moved through the Balkans, leaving a trail of plunder and violence behind them. They looted Byzantine towns and villages with the same ferocity as if they were the lands of the infidel. With great difficulty, the Romaeos managed to escort them to Constantinople and quickly ferry them across to Asia Minor, where nearly all of them were immediately slaughtered by the Turks. But this was only the prelude. Following them came the true force, the army of heavily armored Western knights led by powerful dukes and princes. And when Alexios saw them beneath the walls of his capital, he felt a mixed sense of awe and dread. He had never seen so many men clad in steel. It was a formidable force, but it was utterly alien and beyond his control. From the very beginning, a vast cultural chasm manifested between the sophisticated, intrigue-accustomed Byzantines and the crude, straightforward, and immensely proud Western barons. The Romaios looked upon the Latins as uneducated, unwashed barbarians. The Crusaders, in turn, saw the Greeks as effete, treacherous, and cowardly heretics who did not deserve to rule such a great empire. Alexios attempted to seize control of the situation. He met each Crusader leader with elaborate pomp, showering them with gold and silk. But in return, he demanded one thing, that they take an oath of vassalage to him. They had to swear that all ancient Byzantine cities they recaptured from the Turks would be returned to the emperor's authority. After all, these were the empire's lands. The Crusaders, grumbling, took the oath, but secretly deemed it humiliating and had no intention of keeping it. At first, the cooperation seemed to work. The combined forces of the Crusaders and Byzantines captured Nicaea, the Seljuk capital. Alexios used cunning to force the city to surrender to him specifically, preventing the knights from sacking it, an act that sparked their first outburst of fury. The Crusaders then pushed deep into Asia Minor. They won several brilliant victories, pushed back the Turks, and recovered vast territories. But, as Alexios feared, they were in no hurry to return them to the empire. The turning point was the siege of Antioch. After a long and bloody siege, the Crusaders took this great ancient city. By right, it should have reverted to Byzantium. But one of the expedition's leaders, the Norman Bohemond, a longtime enemy of Alexios, claimed that the emperor had violated his end of the bargain by not providing sufficient aid, and declared Antioch his own principality. This was open betrayal. From that moment, the fragile alliance completely fractured. For the Byzantines, the Crusaders transformed from allies into invaders, no different from the Turks, only more dangerous because they carried the banner of the cross. And for the Crusaders, the Greeks became treacherous backstabbers who were hindering their sacred mission. The growing mistrust and mutual hatred intensified with every new crusade. The Byzantines tried to manipulate the Crusaders, even making secret alliances with their Muslim enemies. The Crusaders, in turn, increasingly viewed the untold wealth of Constantinople with open greed. The medicine that was meant to heal the empire turned into a slow-acting poison that would be unleashed in the most terrible way a century later. Chapter 20. The Disaster of 1204. A Stab in the Back. The Fourth Crusade. The Sack and Fall of Constantinople. The greatest cultural tragedy of the Middle Ages. A century of mutual hatred, mistrust, and betrayal between the Greeks and the Latins was bound to explode eventually. That explosion occurred at the very beginning of the 13th century. It is known in history as the Fourth Crusade. Initially, this crusade had nothing to do with Byzantium. Its goal was Egypt, the center of Muslim power. But, as often happens, money and politics decided everything. To transport their huge army, the knights contracted with the maritime Republic of Venice. The Venetians, born traders, built a gigantic fleet for them. But when the army assembled in Venice, It turned out that the Crusaders could not pay the agreed-upon sum. They were trapped in a debt crisis. It was then that the old, blind but razor-sharp Doge of Venice, Enrico Dandolo, proposed a deal. He would defer the payment if the Crusaders helped the Venetians with one small matter: capturing the Christian city of Zadar on the Adriatic coast for them. There was only one problem. Zadar was a Christian city, and so the army that had sworn to fight the infidels attacked Christians to settle its debts. This was the first step toward disaster. Then, a Byzantine prince, Alexios Angelos, entered the scene. His father had been overthrown, and he wandered Europe seeking help. He found the Crusaders and made them an offer they could not refuse. He promised them dizzying rewards: to pay all their debt to the Venetians, give them a huge sum on top of that, provide an army for the march to the Holy Land, and, most importantly, submit the Orthodox Church to the Pope's authority. All they had to do was help him reclaim the throne in Constantinople. Greed, mixed with the pious pretext of healing the church schism, won out. The vast fleet of Crusaders and Venetians turned away from the Holy Land toward Christian Constantinople. In 1203, they took the city relatively easily and installed their puppet prince on the throne. But it quickly became clear that his promises were hollow. The empire's ravaged treasury was empty. The people of Constantinople hated both the new puppet emperor and his Latin allies, who behaved like masters in the city. Soon, the emperor was overthrown and killed. The Crusaders then decided they had been tricked and that the only way to get what they were promised was to take the city for themselves. In April 1204, they launched a second decisive assault. What followed was not just the capture of a city. It was a 3-day frenzy of barbarism, the greatest single act of plunder in history. The Crusaders, forgetting all their vows, rushed to loot and destroy. They murdered civilians, burst into homes, monasteries, and, most terrifyingly, churches. They desecrated Hagia Sophia. Drunken knights drank wine from sacred chalices, tore precious metal casings from icons, and, according to eyewitness accounts, placed a prostitute on the patriarchal throne. For 3 days, they methodically carried off everything of value. Priceless works of ancient art that had been stored in the city for 1,000 years were melted down into coins. The famous quadriga, the 4 bronze horses that adorned the hippodrome, was taken to Venice, where it still stands today on St. Mark's Basilica. Countless Christian relics, fragments of the true cross, the crown of thorns, and the relics of apostles were stolen and dispersed throughout the churches of Western Europe. Libraries containing the wisdom of antiquity were burned. This was the end. For the first time in its 900-year history, Constantine's city fell to an enemy's blows. But that enemy was neither the Persians, nor the Arabs, nor the Turks. It was their brothers in faith. The Byzantine Empire was destroyed. On its ruins, the Crusaders created their own state, the Latin Empire. The blow of 1204 was fatal. It inflicted a wound upon the entire Christian world that has never truly healed. Chapter 21. The Empire in Exile. How the fragments of Byzantium, Nicaea, Trebizond survived and fought for the return of the capital. After 1204, it seemed that the nearly 1,000-year history of the Roman Empire had come to an inglorious end. The great city, the Queen of Cities, was in the hands of the Latins. A Western emperor sat on the throne, and Catholic priests officiated in Hagia Sophia. The empire's lands were divided between the Venetians and the Frankish barons, like spoils after a successful hunt. But one could capture the city, one could steal its treasures, but one could not kill the idea of the empire itself. For the Romaios, their state was not just a territory. It was a sacred, divinely ordained order that could not simply vanish. And across the Greek world, in those corners unreachable by the Crusaders' swords, centers of resistance began to emerge. The empire had not died. It had simply gone into exile. Several such fragments of Byzantium arose, and each considered itself the sole legitimate successor. In the west, in the Balkans, the despotate of Epirus formed. Its rulers were energetic and warlike, and for a time they became the main Greek power, recapturing city after city from the Latins. Far to the east, on the southern coast of the Black Sea, sheltered by mountains, the empire of Trebizond survived. It was ruled by a branch of the Komnenian dynasty. This distant, exotic fragment of the Old World would last the longest, evolving into a wealthy trading state. But the principal center of hope, the true heart of the empire in exile, became the Empire of Nicaea. It arose in Asia Minor, quite close to the captured Constantinople. Its founder was the aristocrat Lord Valerius, Theodore Lascaris. In the small city of Nicaea, he gathered around him all who managed to flee the capital: noblemen, military commanders, and scholars. Crucially, the Orthodox Patriarch also relocated there. Nicaea became a small but proud Constantinople in miniature. The Nicaean emperors did not see themselves as rulers of some new state. They were the legitimate emperors of the Romaios, temporarily outside their capital, and all their policies, all their lives, were subject to one single sacred goal: to return home, to recover the city. It was a time of astonishing resilience. The rulers of Nicaea were not dreamers, but pragmatists. They did not launch suicidal attacks against the powerful walls of Constantinople. Instead, they patiently and systematically rebuilt the state. They constructed hospitals and libraries, encouraged agriculture, and strengthened the army. They used diplomacy, forging alliances with the Bulgarians or even the Turks against their Latin enemies and Greek rivals from Epirus. For decades, the Nicaeans conserved their strength. They looked across the strait at their violated capital, where the Latin Empire weakened with each passing year. The Latins were poor rulers, their state impoverished, and Constantinople itself fell into decay. Its palaces and churches crumbled, and its population scattered. The empire in exile lived for one great dream. And that dream, passed from father to son, burned so brightly that one day it was bound to become reality. The day of the return was approaching. Chapter 22. The Last Renaissance. The Paleologos Revival. A restored but weak empire. The flourishing of philosophy and art against a backdrop of political decline. The dream the Nicaean Empire had lived for nearly 60 years was realized suddenly, almost by chance. In July 1261, a small reconnaissance detachment led by the Nicaean General Cassian, Alexios Strategopoulos, approached Constantinople. He discovered that the main Latin garrison and the Venetian fleet had departed on a campaign. The city was virtually defenseless. Through a secret passage shown to him by local residents, his soldiers infiltrated the walls. After a brief skirmish, the last Latin rulers fled in a panic aboard ships. Constantinople was back in the hands of the Romaios. A few weeks later, the Nicaean Emperor Michael VIII Palaiologos solemnly entered his capital on foot through the Golden Gate, replicating the route of the ancient triumphant emperors. The people rejoiced. The nightmare seemed over, and the great empire was reborn. But when the euphoria subsided, the bitter truth was revealed. This was not the empire they had lost. It was merely its ghost. Michael inherited a city that lay in ruins. Its beautiful palaces were burned, its forums overgrown with weeds, and its population had shrunk tenfold. One contemporary sadly wrote that the city had turned into a desert. The restored empire itself was merely a shadow of its former greatness. It was a head without a body. It consisted of the capital, a few islands, and scattered pockets of land in the Balkans and Asia Minor. It was surrounded by new, young, and predatory states. In the Balkans, the mighty Serbian kingdom was gaining strength, while on the sea, the Italian merchant republics of Venice and Genoa ruled all, controlling all trade and suffocating Byzantium's economy. But the most terrible developments were occurring in the east. In Asia Minor, the vacuum left when the Nicaeans departed to recapture Constantinople began to be filled by new Turkic tribes, more ferocious and organized than the Seljuks. Among them was one, initially the most insignificant, led by a chieftain named Emir Murad, Osman. It was from this small tribe that the last and most terrible threat to Byzantium would emerge, the Ottoman Turks. Politically and economically, the empire was mortally ill. It was dying slowly. Yet one of the most astonishing phenomena in history occurred here. Precisely during this period, against the backdrop of complete state decline, Byzantine culture experienced its final, dazzlingly bright surge. It is called the Palaiologos Renaissance. As if sensing its imminent demise, the empire, like a candle before it goes out, flared up in a final flame of genius. In monasteries and scriptoria, humanist scholars studied and commented with new passion on the works of ancient Greek philosophers, Plato and Aristotle. They debated the nature of light, the soul, and divine energy, anticipating many ideas of the Italian Renaissance. But this Renaissance manifested most vividly in art. The mosaics and frescoes of this period lost their old, rigid stillness. They acquired movement, emotion, and deep humanity. The best example is the mosaics of the Chora Church in Constantinople. The faces of the saints there are full of tenderness and sorrow. In the scenes from the lives of Christ and the Mother of God, we see not detached symbols, but a living story full of drama. This was a farewell, the farewell of a great civilization to the world. As its body faded, consumed by enemies and poverty, its spirit created these final, poignantly beautiful masterpieces. The empire was preparing to die, but first it gathered all its 1,000 years of wisdom and beauty to pass it on as a legacy to future generations. Chapter 23. The Rise of the Ottoman Threat. How the Ottoman Turks encircled Constantinople, turning the empire into a city-state. The last cultural flourish of the Palaiologos occurred against the backdrop of an inexorable geopolitical decline. While scholars in Constantinople debated Plato, a force was growing in the east that was destined to put an end to the history of the Second Rome. This force was born out of the chaos left after the Mongol invasion, which crushed the old Seljuk Sultanate. On its ruins arose numerous small Turkic principalities, or beyliks. Among them was one, initially the most insignificant, located right on the border with Byzantine territory. Its ruler was the warrior named Emir Murad. The Ottomans possessed two key advantages. First, their border position constantly attracted the Ghazi, the warriors of Islam from across the Turkic world, who yearned to fight the infidels and gain military glory. This gave Emir Murad and his successors a constant influx of motivated and battle-hardened fighters. Second, unlike many of their rivals, the Ottoman rulers were incredibly pragmatic and talented state builders. They didn't just plunder conquered lands, they incorporated them into their rapidly expanding state, creating an effective administration and a powerful, disciplined army. This young, passionate force began its irresistible movement. Step by step, city by city, the Ottomans wrested away the weakening Byzantium's last Asian possessions. Prusa fell, becoming their first capital. Nicaea fell. Nicomedia fell. By the mid-14th century, all of Asia Minor, once the heart of the empire, was in their hands. And then, the unthinkable happened. In 1354, taking advantage of an earthquake that destroyed the walls of the fortress of Gallipoli, the Ottomans crossed into Europe for the first time and seized their first foothold in the Balkans. Now, they were squeezing Constantinople from two sides. For Byzantium, this was the beginning of the end. The Ottomans initially left the city alone. It was still too strong for them. Instead, they began to conquer the Balkans. They routed the Serbs at the famous Battle of Kosovo Field. They crushed the Bulgarians. They became the masters of the entire region. The Byzantine Empire shrank to a miserable fragment. By the end of the 14th century, it consisted of Constantinople, with its immediate surroundings, a few islands, and a semi-independent enclave in Greece. It had become a city-state, an island in the midst of a raging Ottoman sea. Furthermore, the once proud emperors of the Ramaios, the successors of Augustus and Constantine, were reduced to the humiliated vassals of the Ottoman Sultan. They were obliged to pay him tribute, supply soldiers for his army, and even, at his command, follow him on military campaigns against other Christians. It was the deepest humiliation. The emperor of the Christian world became the servant of a Muslim overlord. A few times, salvation seemed close. Western Europe, finally realizing the Ottoman threat, mounted crusades, but they were defeated time and again by the Ottoman war machine. Once, the city was saved by a miracle when Sultan Bayezid the Thunderbolt was preparing for the final assault. From the east, the great conqueror Tamerlane crashed into the Ottomans. He routed Bayezid and postponed Byzantium's demise for a few decades. But it was only a postponement. The Ottomans recovered from the defeat. They rebuilt and strengthened their empire, and Constantinople, alone, impoverished and nearly depopulated, awaited its inevitable fate. The question was no longer if it would fall, but when. Chapter 24. The Fall of 1453, the finale of a 1,000-year drama. Sultan Mehmed II, the Conqueror, the giant cannons, and the last emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos. In the spring of 1453, the finale of the 1,000-year drama became inevitable. A new young sultan sat on the Ottoman throne. He was only 21, but he possessed the mind of a genius and the will of a tyrant. His name was Mehmet II. Since childhood, he had been obsessed with one idea, one dream, one prophecy: to capture Constantinople. He studied maps of the city, plans of its fortifications, and read accounts of past failed sieges. He knew that whoever took this city would forever inscribe his name in history. On the Byzantine throne sat the last emperor. His name was Constantine XI Palaiologos, and he shared the name of the great city's founder. He was a courageous, noble, and tragic figure to whom fate had handed not the scepter of power, but the burden of defending a hopeless cause. Mehmet prepared for the assault with methodical thoroughness. He assembled a colossal army, estimated by various sources to be between 100,000 and 200,000 warriors. But his chief advantage was not the infantry. His trump card was artillery. Specifically for him, the Hungarian engineer gun founder named Ulrich, whose services the impoverished Byzantine emperor had declined, cast previously unseen monsters. Chief among them was the colossal bombard basilica, which fired half-ton stone balls. This was a duel of the new age against antiquity, gunpowder against stone. Inside the city, Constantine could muster no more than 7, perhaps 8,000 defenders. These were the remnants of the guard, the city militia, and about 700 courageous Genoese volunteers, led by the professional soldier Giovanni Giustiniani Longo. The odds were against them, 1 defender for every few dozen attackers. The city was doomed. The last desperate pleas for aid sent to the west dissolved in political intrigues. In early April 1453, the massive Ottoman army encamped outside the city walls, and the cannons began to speak. The ancient Theodosian walls, which for 1,000 years had repelled the attacks of the Huns, Avars, Arabs and Bulgarians, began to crumble under the impact of the giant stone balls. By day, the cannons breached the walls. By night, the few defenders, risking their lives under the cover of darkness, patched them up with whatever they could: stones, logs, and sacks of earth. Sultan Mehmet also demonstrated tactical genius. To circumvent the gigantic chain blocking the entrance to the Golden Horn Inlet, he committed the unheard of. He ordered the construction of a wooden slipway and, overnight, dragged about 70 of his ships overland, across the hill, directly into the city's inner harbour. The defenders now had to fight on the sea walls as well. The siege lasted 53 days. 53 days of continuous thunder, fear, and fading hope. On the night of May 29th, before the decisive assault, a ringing silence fell over the city. The last Christian service was held in Hagia Sophia. In the twilight beneath the Great Dome, Orthodox Greeks and Catholic Genoese prayed together, forgetting all their centuries-old disputes in the face of shared destruction. Emperor Constantine addressed his warriors, urging them in his final speech to die for their faith, their home, and their empire. At dawn, the assault began. 3 waves of attackers shattered one after another against the defenders' resilience. But the forces were too unequal. The fatal moment came when the Genoese commander Giustiniani was gravely wounded. He was carried from the field, demoralizing his men. Around the same time, the Turks discovered that one of the small hidden postern gates in the wall, the Kirkeporta, had been left unlocked by someone's error. Through it poured the first detachments of Janissaries, and all was lost. Ottoman banners appeared on the walls. The slaughter and looting began. The last emperor of the Romaios, Constantine XI, understanding that the city had fallen, tore off his imperial insignia so as not to be distinguished from a common soldier, and with a cry plunged into the thick of the fighting Turks. He died as befitted the last Caesar, in battle defending his city. His body was never recovered. Legend holds that when news of the breach reached him, he uttered a phrase full of infinite bitterness. "The city has fallen, and I am still alive." On that day, May 29th, 1453, the Roman Empire, which had existed in one form or another for over 2,000 years, finally ceased to exist. The Second Rome had fallen. The era of the Middle Ages was drawing to its bloody close. Chapter 25. The Legacy of the Eagle. What Byzantium gave the world? Orthodoxy, Cyrillic, the idea of autocracy in the East, and the Greek scholars who fueled the Italian Renaissance. With the fall of Constantinople in 1453, the heart of the thousand-year empire stopped beating. The last emperor of the Ramaios fell on his city's walls. But was this its true death? Or, like a dying star, did it illuminate the birth of new worlds with its final flash? What remains when walls crumble and the voices of emperors fade? A legacy remains. And the main legacy of Byzantium is the vast Orthodox world it created. The Balkan peoples, Serbs, Bulgarians, and, most importantly, the Eastern Slavs, received from Constantinople not just a faith. They received the Cyrillic script created by its missionaries. They received iconography, architecture, and codes of law. The Kievan realm, and later the Muscovite state, saw themselves as the spiritual successors of the fallen empire. When the Second Rome fell, the idea was born in Moscow that it was now the Third Rome, the last bastion of the true faith. The very concept of Russian autocracy, the idea of the Tsar as God's anointed, is a direct inheritance of the Byzantine model of imperial power. But Byzantium left its mark not only in the East. Its parting gift to the West proved no less valuable. Throughout the 15th century, as the Ottoman noose tightened around Constantinople, an exodus began from the city, primarily to Italy. The best minds of the empire, philosophers, philologists, and scholars, left. They carried with them not gold or jewels, but a treasure far more valuable: knowledge. They carried the manuscripts of ancient Greek authors that had either been forgotten in Europe or were known only through poor Latin translations. It was these Greek scholars who brought to Italy the complete works of Plato, the original texts of Aristotle, Ptolemy's geography, and Galen's medicine. They began teaching the Greek language in Florentine and Venetian academies. This flow of ancient wisdom became the oxygen that fanned the smouldering coals of interest in antiquity into a blazing fire. The exodus of Byzantine intellectuals was one of the most powerful catalysts that propelled the Italian Renaissance. The great library of antiquity, which Byzantium had carefully preserved for 1,000 years, was passed into new hands just before its demise. Finally, Byzantium remains an eternal symbol. A symbol of resilience, a symbol of the preservation of culture amidst barbarism, a symbol of an empire that saw its mission not so much in conquest as in enlightenment and order. The symbol of this legacy is the double-headed eagle of the Paleologos, which gazes simultaneously west and east. This symbol was adopted by many states, including Russia, as a sign of their imperial continuity. The empire died, but its echo continues to resonate in our world. In the liturgy of the Orthodox Church, in the letters used to write these words, in the ideas of power and statecraft, and in the immortal creations of the Renaissance. The Second Rome fell, but its soul proved immortal. Conclusion: the whisper of the Second Rome. And so, our long saga comes to a close. The thousand-year history of the Second Rome, which began with one emperor's dream, concluded with the last breath of another. The empire fell, but its legacy, like ripples on water, spread throughout the world. It lives on in the solemnity of orthodox icons, in the letters with which these words are written, and in the very idea of the state as a protector of faith and order. For almost 1,000 years, Byzantium was a shield, absorbing the blows intended for a young and weak Europe. It was a library that safeguarded the wisdom of the ancient world for us. It was a beacon whose light, though fading, pointed the way to the Italian Renaissance. And now, allow these images, the images of golden mosaics, the soaring dome of Hagia Sophia, the brave emperors and the crumbling walls, to slowly dissolve like the dust of ages, settling down to make way for silence and peace. The history is complete. The book is closed. If you feel your eyelids growing heavy, allow the grand story of life on earth to wrap around you gently and guide you into calm. Don't forget to subscribe to listen to more of our bedtime stories. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and slowly drift into sleep, into silence, into the boundless, timeless current where all life intertwines. Your Between Sleep and Science channel, wishing you a quiet, comforting night.